about this. We are excited about this webinar and the panelists that we have for you today. My name is Amanda Newlove. I am one of the 4 interns at the Unitarian Universalist Association at the United Nations office. And we are thrilled to bring you this panel of experts from around the globe who are going to be discussing the growing challenges that climate change is having on women and girls. We will hear about specific communities who are being impacted by climate disasters. And we will also be talking about the importance of hope and how, above all else, children particularly should be given these kind of messages as they are the future solution finders for all of these issues. Again, please feel free to introduce yourselves. As the webinar goes on, if you have any questions, feel free to drop your questions in the chat box. We will hopefully have enough time at the end to go over all of the questions and have a Q&A with the panelists. I'm going to pass it over to Bruce Knotts, who is the director of the UU at UN office and our moderator for this event today.
Hello, everybody. It's my honor and privilege to introduce our first speaker, Anjan Yaz, who is the founder of the Maple Advisory Group, a global education organization committed to rising ambitions of low-income learners across the globe. She is also a senior management consultant at EY, currently based between London and Lahore. She has 13 plus years of experience as a practitioner and researcher in the education sector. Most notably, Anya led the development of Pakistan's first English as a foreign language curriculum for the world's largest low-cost private school network, the Citizens Foundation. She has advised governments and their national evaluation and assessment policies with the OECD in France. Her focus remains on using innovative methods and experimentation to raise the bar for what's possible for the most marginalized learners in the global South. She received her master's in comparative and international education from the University of Oxford in 2017. Please welcome Anya Mystery.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Amanda and team, for having me. I'm delighted to be able to have some time discussing a topic that's close to me, both professionally as well as personally. Let me know if you're able to see me as I shift screens right now. Does that work, Amanda? Thumbs up, fab, great. Okay, so today I would like to take the opportunity to apply a unique lens to the impact that the climate crisis is having on women. And I want to do that by focusing on the diminishing agency of women and girls as a result of the climate crisis. As we know, agriculture sector is big across various countries, including Pakistan, which is the case that I'll be focusing on today. In fact, the agriculture sector in Pakistan directly supports the country's economy. Up to 26% of its GDP is accounted by the agri sector. Across the world, you can say that about 40 to 70% of the workforce working in agriculture is made up of women. And in Pakistan, that is a high 67%. So when climatic changes are on the rise, varied impacts are, of course, forecasted on the country, in particular, reducing agricultural productivity, as well as increasing the variability of water availability. So interestingly, because we have such a high number of women working in the agri sector, it's important to note that both of these areas being impacted, so the productivity in the agriculture sector, as well as the accessibility of water, they primarily and directly involve women. It's no surprise, of course, that women are already facing and will continue to face the severest discriminatory impacts of climate change. Let's take a deeper look now into the agriculture productivity and variability of water, and both at its impact on women, both in their household as well as in the workplace. So at the work front, let's take the example of Sindh, which is one of the top 2 most rural provinces of Pakistan, which has the majority engagement of women in the agri sector. Here, women are spending between 12 to 14 hours a day in the field. Their involvement can include everything from crop production, livestock, dairy management, forestry, poultry rearing, as well as fishing. Now, what is happening in this interaction that women have in the workplace due to the climate crisis? When there are natural disasters taking place, such as floods, women lose their jobs because the only place they can work is in the field, and therefore they're losing their only source of income. When droughts take place, on the other hand, livestock becomes limited, and once again, women lose their access to a source of income. Their jobs are seasonal at best, and they are not afforded the right to leave home to go far distances to acquire work, therefore limiting their agency in deciding what they can do to make money and how to spend time in their life. Now let's take a look at what's happening in terms of the climate crisis and its impact on women in the home space. I'd like to begin by sharing a quote from a friend who is a fast becoming renowned active climate change activist and lawyer, Sarah Hayat. And in one of her newspaper pieces, she wrote, "Women living in rural areas of Pakistan tend to feel the impacts of climate change more aggressively due to their assigned traditional gender roles and responsibilities. Being solely accountable for essential domestic tasks makes women highly dependent on depleting natural resources like water and firewood." I just want us to take a minute and pause to let that sink in, because you're talking about a majority number of women of a growing 220 million person population that's working in these rural, even urban areas that have agriculture activity. And we're talking about how climate change means they're not only not going to have access to work, but they're going to lose the ability to provide for their children and provide food security to their households. If we take a look at the impact of climate change on agriculture productivity in terms of women's household and private lives, floods mean less work, which means less money, which means girls are the first ones out of school. Once again, men, they'll continue to have that access to an income. They can actually be the ones who can pay for school. So they're the ones who get to decide whether the daughters or the sisters or the cousins, whether the females can go to school or not. So once again, women are robbed of that decision. So as a mother, you can't really decide if you want to continue sending your daughter to school because you don't have any financial power. This sort of stripping of right to make that decision is something that directly means that the climate crisis is diminishing women's agency. Natural disasters also mean that women are spending more time at home because they don't have work in the fields. And research has captured this results in a noticeable increase in domestic violence. Women who are the primary caretakers and ensures of food security, they have to cover longer distances to access water. This means they are once again exposed to sexual abuse and harassment because of lack of security, just because they need to walk longer distances. Furthermore, even though women account for less than 10% of land ownership, they're the ones who are left behind to take care of the home when climatic impact is forecasted. Men tend to leave with the children to find more work and find security. And even though women don't own the property, they're deemed the caretakers of it. Whether they survive or not doesn't matter. Furthermore, there's growing scholarship of evidence that actually demonstrates interlinkages between floods and women's sexual and reproductive health. Past floods, such as the one in 2010 in Pakistan, which left about 6 million people displaced, it found that only 1 in 4 women had access to any type of medical facility whilst being pregnant. Most of the bathrooms or toilets in the facilities or outside had no running water. And women, once again, had no choice but to bear the brunt of the severe climate crisis, having no other option. So based on my experience in the last 13 or so years working across different multiple countries, contexts that are specifically low income, girls' education, which is, even though it's seen as instrumental and it's seen as valuable, both promoting national and economic development, it is one of the first rights that is withdrawn from women. One can even argue that schools provide children around the world with the ability to read, write, question, and understand the world that they live in, right? But if you're saying that the first impact is you take girls out of school, you're robbing them of their ability to become decision makers, to be independent thinkers. And to me, this is one of the gravest impacts of the climate crisis on women. It's the loss of their agency, their ability to think for themselves and make choices about their own lives. And in this way, we continue to keep them in a cycle of remaining at the periphery and being subject to socio-emotional, psychological, and physical violence, because they are not seen as owners of their existence, right? They're just seen as receivers of that opportunity to be alive. There are instances when natural disasters have hit and women have actually not been given the choice of escaping, and they're left behind because they're seen as a burden. This demonstrates that they're not allowed to make any decisions that have to do with their own survival. Therefore, my focus is very much on how do we enable women to be able to make choices freely. And there's so much research that demonstrates when women decide, children lead better lives, and societies shift and economies shift with that. Of course, I wouldn't want to end my contribution on a hopeless note. And I think that the good news is that there is hope and there's very tangible interventions that we can be focusing on. I think that so much of global investment when we're responding to climate crisis is looking at water rising levels, water management. You're looking also at how do we get girls to school? How do we build schools or construct buildings or infrastructure that is safer, it's higher in terms of level? I would actually say that we really need to prioritize mindset shift in men. They are the major barriers and blockers to women's access to not just survival, but safety and progress and education and running water. All the things that women are held responsible for, women are actually not able to own those responsibilities. The ownership stays with men. And it's through gradual mindset shifts and interventions that bring the husbands, the fathers, the sons, the male cousins into the fold, I think can bring about the change that we want. Also, it's really important to make sure women are going to be part of the dialogue. So they need to be the policymakers and they need to be the government officials and they need to be the campaigners at both community, so micro level and macro level. Using language that's strategic and that makes sure that the men want to be on this journey with the women will be key. Otherwise, you're literally just sort of hitting your head against the wall because culture and traditional interpretations of religious norms will dictate that women have no place in being decision makers. So the key is how do we shift men's mindsets? And there's many ways we can do that. And there's ample research that supports that. But also doing that in a strategic way that ensures that they will be on that journey and create that space for women. So yes, I'd like to stop there, pause there, actually not pause, but stop there for any questions or comments.
I believe our intern from Fordham University, Anya Mystery, has a question for you.
Thanks very much, Anya. That was very interesting. That's what I was going to ask you is how do we build capacity, at the school level? And because I think that's where it starts, and the whole traditional thing of women and their role. I've looked at many school examples and they still put boys doing the carpentry and the girls doing the caring. How do we change that mindset so that all girls and all boys do the same tasks? To me, that's the only way you're going to expand the whole thing.
That's a great question. So when I've worked in schools, especially across Pakistan, what I have found works is, number one, accepting that this is a long process. Mindset shift can take generations, and we need to embrace that. It's not a blocker, it's actually an enabler if you accept it, and it creates space to do some of the doing. Number two, the curriculum has a lot of opportunity with examples, which can bring the women's role into a much more sort of into the big field. So when you're reading history, geography, English, science, whatever subject you're reading, often women are referred to in particular roles. It can be as simple as when you're reading a story for English, right? And you're really seeing the traditional roles come to life again and again. So looking at that, revising gender representation in curricula. Number three, something that I have found to be instrumental is, and this takes time, right? And this takes a lot of human resource, is when you're doing teacher upskilling or professional development, more across like a network scale or even at a particular school, the type of activities that you're doing need to bring men and women in the same space together. There's such a sort of disconnect because men tend to stay separate and women tend to stay separate. Bringing them together purposefully in a respectful, safe environment where they can talk to each other, I think can be massive enabler. So literally having like being in the same physical space and not being segregated. Another way is for us to be spending time in communities to map community sentiment towards women's roles and to work backwards from that. So why does a father feel discouraged to send their child to school? Why does he want his daughter at 14 married? What are his fears? And using the language of his fears, that we can address these fears to help win them. And that's a long process. But yeah, so these would be sort of my 4 key go-tos to get this process going.
Thank you very much. Really wonderful insights. I think we're ready to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Ryan Ehrhart. He is a professor in the Environmental Studies and Sciences program at Adelphi University in Garden City, New York. He earned his PhD in Human Geography at City University of New York Graduate Center. His research interests have ranged from the class and gender dynamics of rural development in the Philippines to social and environmental justice and sustainable development planning in New York City and Long Island. Please welcome Dr. Ryan Ehrhart.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I'm really honored to join this panel. I'm so glad that this was organized and sort of in conjunction with the events going on at the United Nations this week as well. So the burdens of climate change, displacement, homelessness, poverty, sexual violence, disease, weigh more heavily on women and girls, yet it's men who have a larger carbon footprint than women and are thus more culpable for creating the problem. As Catherine Wilkinson, a researcher and proponent of climate feminism, has argued, climate change is a threat multiplier. Wherever we see imbalances and injustices, climate change is going to amplify those inequalities. A number of philosophers have discussed how capitalist patriarchy is the problem. Patriarchy valorizes production, but denigrates social reproduction. In other words, our society tends to hold in high esteem those who can bring in income, whereas those activities that are about maintaining our social environment, cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, elder care, aren't respected in the same way. Jane Moakley and Bruce Braun said that the emancipation of nature and women can come about only with a restructuring of society to an economy not based on profit, but rather on sustainable development. We need an ethics of care. As Wilkinson said, it's going to take collaboration, connection, compassion, and creativity. Belle Plumwood and Karen Warren, they wrote about how we need to overcome gender dualisms in our cultures. We need to overcome the tendency to think that environment is somehow separate from humans. Patriarchy orders the world in hierarchical ways, as does capitalism. With that type of mindset, human interactions with the environment are going to be exploitative rather than cooperative. Now, I don't think a market economy is going away anytime soon, but the deregulated capitalist economy has shown itself to be a spectacular failure when it comes to protecting environmental quality and stability. Perhaps the place with the greatest potential for suffering in the 21st century is sub-Saharan Africa. There is a danger that there will be 3 large trends happening. The first is industrialization, which will be driven by China, pushing its dirtiest industries to the places where wages are low and environmental protections are weak. This is the same thing that American corporations did to China starting decades ago. The second large trend is a change to the agricultural economy, which I'll say more about in a moment. And the third, of course, is climate change, which will especially affect performance and stability in the agricultural sector. That first trend, industrialization, will drive a massive rural to urban migration, but this may not happen in a gender balanced way. More men may go to the cities to get industrial jobs and go to mines to get mining jobs. With massive population growth forecasted for the region, there will be a downward pressure on wages, and that will mean that not many of those wages will make their way into the rural communities. The rural areas, which may have more women, will struggle with droughts, pest infestations, severe weather events, and a general lack of predictability, which will all hinder agricultural yields. If corporations successfully press for free trade policies, such as the removal of tariffs and other forms of protectionism, there will be pressure for the agricultural economy to move toward a more export-oriented model and away from a food sovereignty framework. This will be difficult terrain for all small farmers, but perhaps especially for women, since women may have a tougher time acquiring or holding onto land in a patriarchal legal system. Thus, we are likely to see a wave of land consolidation by elites, leaving women in an economically vulnerable position where they are struggling to find low-paying agricultural wage labor jobs. And since family sizes tend to be even larger in rural areas, the abundance of cheap labor will keep wages low and unemployment or underemployment will be high. It is in that economic environment that the least fortunate will be especially vulnerable to sexual violence and exploitation. In order for that scenario to not play out, governments and non-governmental organizations need to push to establish better ground rules for how economies work and for what we really value. We need governments to be setting goals for things like environmental improvement, reductions in gender, class, and racial inequality, better health outcomes for citizens, and better educational opportunities. The problem is that those things tend to take a back seat to economic growth and the expansion of GDP, gross domestic product. It's always going to be an uphill battle if the primary focus of governments is economic growth. So I have 10 points that governments and NGOs can focus on. Number one, education for girls. A woman who has had 12 years of schooling or more has significantly fewer children. Lower population growth will be important to keep greenhouse gas emissions lower and to keep both rural and urban areas stable. Educated women have more economic resources, their agricultural plots reap higher yields, and their families are better nourished. Education for all, especially girls, will be important to economically empower women so they are less dependent on men for their financial security. This will result in less vulnerability to sexual violence and exploitation. Okay, number two, economic empowerment of women. With better education comes better opportunities. Job training, microfinancing, enforcement of minimum wage laws, paid maternal and paternal leave that allows parents to have careers, subsidized childcare. These are a number of ways to use economic policies that are completely egalitarian in nature that will help women gain equality. Number three, better healthcare. A better healthcare system combined with better water and sanitation leads to maternal health, infant health, lowered infant mortality, and a lower total fertility rate. When parents are confident that their children are not going to die, they tend to have smaller families and population growth slows down. A healthier and more educated population is also more likely to be productive in the workplace. Agricultural yields will go up, industrial worker productivity will increase. Number four, land rights for women. Bina Agarwal has written about how important it is for women to own land. Women frequently have problems inheriting land because of inequalities in legal and customary practices. Agarwal also discussed the need to facilitate group ownership of property, which can be useful for women smallholders who can benefit from scale economies. Most countries do not even keep statistics on the gender of landowners, and this makes it difficult to assess whether legal advancements are translating into actual changes in ownership. Agarwal has also written about the importance of women's access to common property resources, CPR is the abbreviation, such as forests, village commons, and water bodies. If privatization blocks this access, this can increase the economic vulnerability of those who are using those resources. Number 5, food sovereignty. Better prices for farmers, sustainable agriculture, and stability in agricultural communities are all important. Governments need to consider price supports for farmers on key crops. As climate change means rockier times for farmers, this can mean that kids get pulled out of school to work in the fields. If girls are not getting educated, it will mean they're more vulnerable to exploitation and more likely to end up in early marriages, where they're much less likely to have financial autonomy. Out of desperation, some parents will arrange marriages for their daughters in order to get a dowry in exchange for her. A 2020 UN report found that girls who are married early are also more likely to perpetuate stereotypical gender roles and to transmit these norms to their own children. So by 2050, average temperatures in the Sahel in Africa could rise by as much as 2 degrees Celsius. Hotter temperatures are going to mean drier soil that retains less moisture, and this will make it harder to grow food, especially for subsistence farmers. If we look at Syria, climate displacement occurred as the agricultural lands dried up and became unproductive. This meant internally displaced persons moving into the cities of Syria and refugees crossing international borders, especially once the civil war started. Now, with climate change, we see that often the dry places get drier, but the wet places get wetter. In some places, it's the heaviness and suddenness of the rains that causes problems. The farmers I talked to in the Philippines were all concerned about crop damage and erosion from heavy rains. They were no longer confident about when to plant their crops because they had seen such unpredictability in the weather. Now, food sovereignty will mean that countries can determine their trade policies and agricultural production policies themselves. They will make sure their staple foods are locally produced. They will make sure that soil fertility is enhanced and the ecological stability of farming land will be maintained. They will make sure that farmers get decent prices for their crops and that families who are farming will not fall into poverty. If rural communities are economically stable, then this will slow the rural to urban migration that destabilizes cities and results in slum conditions and a low quality of urban life. If agricultural communities are destabilized, this will result in millions of climate refugees, which unfortunately increases the likelihood of people being trafficked into forced labor or sexual exploitation. Current estimates are that there are at least 21 million victims of human trafficking around the world, with many people forced into brothels, plantations, domestic servitude, or other situations where they find themselves without the freedom to leave. Numbers of trafficked individuals could expand dramatically if displacement occurs and if those who are in poverty are left to fend for themselves as they respond to the challenges of climate change. Trafficking needs to be combated from both supply and demand perspectives. In other words, lowering supply means reducing the vulnerability of people who are affected by climate change. Reducing demand means taking legal actions against the traffickers. Displacement because of environmental change, it's not a new idea. After all, what is arguably America's greatest novel, Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, is about a family fleeing their ruined landscape. The poor agricultural practices of plains farmers helped cause the crisis of the Dust Bowl. Sadly, the farming families who are going to be displaced in the 21st century are seeing their world change, especially because of the greenhouse gas emissions from elites in faraway places. Number 6, the human right to water. Around the global south, women and girls are responsible for the majority of water collection. As climate changes, droughts will affect many areas, and this will be a hardship on those women who are collecting water. As sea levels rise, many water sources will be salinized. If the sources of water become scarce, then people will likely use more contaminated water sources, and this will result in more sickness and death. The hardest hit demographic will be children under 5. Lack of water can affect women in other ways as well. Without a plentiful supply of water, it's more difficult to carry a pregnancy to term. Giving birth, nursing babies, bathing children, and laundering clothes and diapers all become more difficult in a water-stressed situation. It's women who tend to be responsible for these tasks. And I appreciate what Anya was saying before, that the tasks of social reproduction need to be shared between women and men. There's got to be change about that. Number 7 is fighting back against WTO control of the world economy. Having a World Trade Organization is not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but what is so destructive is that it became a tool of corporations that want to use the WTO to enhance their profits. If labor and environmental concerns were as much a part of WTO negotiations as business concerns, then we could see trade policies move in more progressive directions. Number 8, worker solidarity and union support. Solidarity with workers all over the world is necessary to push back against an economy controlled by elites. If labor movements can advocate for better wages and working conditions, then this will mean greater stability in the economy and better quality of life. Not just factory workers, but service workers and agricultural wage laborers need to organize. That should bring benefits for food security, urban and regional planning, and societal stability. Number 9, strengthen democratic institutions and women's involvement in decision-making. Again, I really appreciate what Anya was talking about here, is that enhancing democratic institutions and encouraging gender-inclusive decision-making will improve trust in the government and enhance long-range planning. This needs to happen at all scales, from the local to the provincial to the national. If we look at the Paris Climate Agreement, it mentioned gender equality, but did not mention sexual and gender-based violence as a specific problem that will be exacerbated by climate change. Prevention efforts need to be coming from all different levels of government. Women's involvement in decision-making on violence prevention, climate policies, and resource use is necessary. Too much climate policy that recognizes women's problems focuses on women as merely operating in the domestic sphere. It's important to see women's dynamic responses to their environment. Makino and Moyo, researchers who analyzed women and decision-making, they said that focusing exclusively on vulnerability detracts attention from the ways in which women actively engage in environmental management. Reforming institutions and providing good governance is part of the process, but this has to happen across different scales. Institutional reform and better policies will only go so far if patriarchal power structures at local levels block the implementation of change. Number 10, greenhouse gas taxing that shifts taxation from taxing income to taxing pollution. Tax the diets, tax the transportation choices, tax the lifestyles that cause the damage. Greenhouse gas taxes will reduce emissions, and then these tax revenues can go back to working class and middle class people in various ways so they can afford the necessities of life in an ever more expensive world. A rare thing that conservatives and progressives can agree on is that they would both like to see their income taxes go down. If we can shift taxation away from the taxation of income and more toward the taxation of pollution and other things detrimental to society, then we will be able to make economic decisions that are not at odds with ecological decisions. Greenhouse gas taxing will especially impact the choices of affluent males. There is potential for greenhouse gas taxation to be a gender equalizer, since women are generally already producing less pollution than men. Now, in conclusion, what you will notice about this list that I just shared is that changes in technology are not included. Now, I'm not saying that employing different technologies is not going to be part of solving the climate crisis, but I am saying that we have to think about climate change not as a technical problem first, but rather as a socio-political problem first. Furthermore, climate change is not a problem that will be solved through changes just in personal consumption choices. It will be through better policies that we will confront the crisis. Collaboration, connection, compassion, and creativity are not just things we need to practice on a personal scale. They're goals that need to inform our policies as well. And a more sustainable and more just world can be the result. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Both really excellent presentations from Anya and Ryan. We're going to have a question in a second, but before we go there, I'm going to mention to our audience and to everybody that we are hosting a seminar in April on climate forced migration, and we may be coming back to you to speak at that. So you might hear from us. So thank you very much. Right now, Rose Singleton, who is our intern from Adelphi University, will ask Dr. Ryan Ehrhart from Adelphi University a question. It's appropriate that we have a Adelphi student asking an Adelphi professor a question.
Hello all. now there seems to be a greater public awareness of climate change, but not its effects on women and girls. And it's not only climate change that's a threat to the environment, to women and girls. Dr. Ryan touched on pollution, plastic pollution, there's deforestation, overfishing, oil spills. What more can be done to show how environmental change and human actions are interconnected? Anya talked about curriculum development and not separating men and women, males and females. New York has a high school for environmental studies. Do we need to start at the grade school level? Because environmental problems began to rise up in the global political agenda back in the 1960s and 70s, but here we are 50 years later, still combating, still trying to progress. So what do you think can be done to, like you said, show that environmental change and human actions are interconnected?
So that's a big question.
I'm sorry. You can handle it, Dr. Ryan.
So I think that, yeah, part of it, obviously a lot of it does boil down to education. And I really agree with, things that Anya was saying, that, changes in curriculum are important. I know, from my experience, kind of growing up, that I didn't get much, much material. We learned the basics, we learned sciences and stuff, but we rarely applied it to the real world. It was kind of, learning things in the abstract. And I think, that's something that kind of needs to change, really apply knowledge to things. There's, Jamie Cloud is somebody who's kind of written about this, sort of analyzing education, things like that. There's, there's a phrase that it takes a child to raise a village. Turning the thing on the head, like the old expression is, it takes a village to raise a child, right? But it takes a child to raise a village. That the idea is that kids can get really excited about learning if they're really engaged, and if they start kind of looking at the world around them as their laboratory, then they can kind of they'll still learn all the basics. They'll learn math, they'll learn chemistry, biology, economics, but do so by like thinking about, how does the school run, what's happening on the grounds of the school, what's happening in our community, and things like that. And I think that there's some real hope there. I think that also, a good thing that I've seen over my lifetime is that there's greater awareness of the connections between human communities and environmental problems. I think especially, when I was younger, there was more focus on wilderness preservation and save the whales over here and the panda bears over there, and those things are all really important. But I think people are getting it more these days. That environmental problems are in the cities and in the suburbs and stuff, and so there's been a real expansion of the environmental justice movement that makes people think about the connections between kind of corporate power and how corporate power sometimes is interwoven with corruption in government, and how that tends to impact people of color more, lower income folks more, and that's it's something that is just a justice problem, something we have to tackle. So So I think that there is hope there. Like when we see like who got appointed as Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, just recently. She's a Native American woman who has always been looking at environmental justice issues. I was so happy to see that she has kind of so this is going to be a priority of this administration. So I think there's some cause for hope there.
Thank you so much. All right, we'll move on to our final speaker, Keya Lamba. Keya is the co-founder of EarthWarriors Global, whose mission is to tackle the climate crisis by empowering Okay, I just lost my script.
Oh, if you want, Bruce, I can, I have some information.
I have it.
Keya. You have it? Okay.
I have it. Okay. Hopefully it won't disappear again. Keya is the co-founder of EarthWarriors Global, whose mission is to tackle the climate crisis by empowering 2 billion children to take action through age-appropriate climate education. Keya began her career as a kindergarten teacher in California with Teach for America. Over the past 9 years, Keya has taught in early childhood classrooms designed to facilitate the teacher professional development and creative play-based curricula for low resource settings across multiple countries. Keya has a master's in international education policy from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she was the Early Childhood Education Zeiss Fellow and undergraduate degree in international development and Chinese from UCLA. Please welcome Keya.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm very excited to tell you about my organization, EarthWarriors, where we provide age-appropriate climate education for young children. And thank you to Amanda for handling the slides. If we could go to the next one. So EarthWarriors was founded by myself with my background in early childhood education, as was just described, and my co-founder Shweta, who has a background in sustainability and education policy. And EarthWarriors is really a marriage of both of our passions. So I would love to get to know a little bit about all of you who are on the call. If while I'm speaking, you could just put your name, your interest in climate change education, and the country that you're in. It's always great to know where people are and what they're interested in to get a bit of a sense. So I'll continue on with my presentation, but if you can put it in the chat, that would be great. So we're going to launch 2 polls here because, again, it's always interesting to find this out. So the first one is, do you believe climate education is important to teach to students, particularly young students? And if you can put your answers in the poll, either yes, no, or not sure. And maybe, Amanda, I'm not sure if you're able to share the results once everyone has put their answers in.
Can you see those results, Keya? Or others?
Yeah, I
can
think it's
see them.
100%.
Yep.
100% yes.
Great.
please answer the second question.
Great, there are your results, Keya, for question number 2.
Interesting. So there's a mix of results around yes, no, not sure. So we're going to dive into this, but really, I think children, especially young children, have the capacity to learn about this complex topic, but the approach that you take is really important to make sure that it is positive and empowering, but we will jump into that shortly. So very interesting that there was a real mix of results here. If we can carry on. So as everyone on this call knows, climate change is a huge issue and children will be the most affected. There's a lot of research that's come out that, children today will face many more extreme weather events, as you can see from the statistics here. And they're more anxious about climate change than anything else. Climate anxiety is really on the rise. And yet nothing is being done to prepare and educate them for the future they will face. So far, Italy is the only country to put climate change learning standards in their national standards. And encouragingly, a lot of countries have made a commitment after COP this year, but that is yet to be seen how it will be integrated. And this is despite the fact that recent research from the Brookings Institute shows that if just 16% of students receive climate education, it will actually lead to a 19 gigaton reduction in future carbon emissions. And to put that in perspective, that's 50% of the world's carbon emissions in the past year. So there is real tangible proof that climate education is a powerful tool to combat climate change. And in addition, as a lot have mentioned so far, women are disproportionately affected by climate change, but also encouragingly, there's a lot of research that shows that they can lead the fight to combat climate change. So as mentioned by both of the previous speakers, women are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And in fact, 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. But they're not only just vulnerable against climate change, they are actually also effective actors or agents of change, both in climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And even more so, the part that we focus on here at EarthWarriors is that actually a lot of research from the Malala Foundation and others show that climate education, particularly for girls, can be an excellent investment against climate change, and really educating not just all students, but in particular girls, is really effective to combating climate change. So we're going to dive into just how we do that at EarthWarriors. So to give you a little sense of what we are, EarthWarriors is a climate change and sustainability curriculum. And so much of what you hear about today around climate change is very doom and gloom. The world is ending. We really try to flip that to take a very positive, solutions-focused and empowering approach to teach the youngest children, 3 to 11-year-olds, about this very complex topic without causing any anxiety. So I wanted to ask you all in the chat, how do you feel when you see this photo? It's a, mother and cub polar bear, very typical of climate change. So I see someone said sad in the chat, unfortunate. If we can go on to the next photo, sad as well, versus how do you feel when you see this photograph? Inspired, hopeful, happy, exactly. So this is uplifted, excellent. So this is exactly the kind of approach we try to take, where a lot these days is actually of the previous photo, very sad, causing anxiety, causing stress, where actually the approach we try to take is that young children are the future and they can have a great impact on their own future. And so we try to be more inspiring and uplifting in our approach. So our whole vision is that we want the next generation to inherit a healthier and greener planet. So these are some of our students at the Girls' Day School Trust, which is actually an all-girls school trust, which have 35 schools in London, and all of their schools have engaged with EarthWarriors. And this is some of their students who've just learned, our youngest students actually, between 5 and 6 years old, who've just done their representations of planet Earth. And our mission is to tackle the climate crisis by empowering 2 billion children to take climate action through age-appropriate climate education. And we've just been recognized by UNESCO as a Green Citizen Initiative, which is very exciting for us, along with receiving support from the Harvard Middle Institute and National Geographic. And we didn't create this curriculum in a vacuum. We had it peer reviewed by experts to make sure that it is the most age appropriate and scientifically accurate, especially for this young age group, because a lot of pushback that we got is, isn't this a very scary topic or complex topic for young students? So we want to make sure that it's taught in a very age appropriate way. All of our activities are play-based to make sure that young children are inspired to become Earth warriors and believe their individual actions can make a difference. So again, back to the poll question that we had, will this cause anxiety in students to teach them about it, especially young students? Research has shown that actually, if you just teach the science of climate change, it can have a negative effect on students. But if you teach that coupled with the social emotional piece and using a positive and empowering approach, it can actually motivate climate action. And 100% of the parents and teachers who participated in our program said that it did not cause any anxiety or stress. So it really depends on the way you teach it. And we also teach it through our engaging characters that you see here, the land, sky, and water warrior, and all of our Mother Earth and so on other characters. So this is a bit about our approach to teaching climate change. We have 5 sort of pillars that we focus on. One is, as an educator yourself, you need to be positive and conquer your fears, because a lot of us did not grow up learning about this. So we're sort of catching up as adults. And so we need to find out the information that we need in order to conquer our own fears. And then 2 is make students feel empowered to take individual action. So at this young age, it really is focused on individual students and what they can do so that they have the foundational knowledge when they grow up to then take systems level action. And 3rd, this is the most important, is you have to make it local and contextual for your students. So there is no one size fits all answer. Every country is facing this in a very different way, and the solutions look very different depending on the resources available to you. And so, you know, we here provide a global curriculum, but actually so much of our curriculum has options for teachers to adapt to what's, you know, connected to the real world for their own students, and they know their students and community and the problems they face best. So we really try to enable them to tailor it and adapt it for what is appropriate for their context and their environment. And then 4th, you know, students, especially young students, really look up to their teachers as role models. So the easiest way is to practice what you preach about sustainability in the classroom. And whatever you can do in your daily habits to show that really affects students. And then finally, have open, positive conversations, because a lot of people feel they need to shield young children from this, but actually, especially around extreme weather events, young kids are very, you know, observant. They know what's happening. And so actually having open conversations is more beneficial and helps their anxiety, as opposed to sort of shielding them and not addressing what's going on. And just a bit about our curriculum.
I know Keya is on a train right now, so she's probably shielding us from some background noise. So we appreciate your patience, everyone.
Sorry about that. There was a very loud announcement. Thank you, Amanda. So we have 4 main modules that we focus on. One is We Are Earth Warriors, which really focuses on the habits, sustainable habits and mindsets that we want kids to build around being an Earth Warrior and feeling positive and hopeful. And then 2 is around the science of climate change. 3 is around waste, and 4 is really that, again, making it local, connecting it to the real world. So this is a community project where students and teachers pick a project in their classroom, in their school, in their community, and then follow our project-based framework to address that and share their solution with the community. And this is just a very quick thing to show you our youngest Earth Warriors in action and how excited they are. Thank you so much, and would love to have your questions and feedback.
Thank you so much. Really a inspiring presentation. And who is asking the question? I think we have an intern that's asking this question. It might be Brooklyn.
Nope, it's me.
Oh, go ahead, Amanda.
Thank you, Keya. It was really inspiring to see how this curriculum just involves so much of the importance of the socio-emotional part of learning about climate change. I think climate grief is very real. So I appreciate that that is a main focus of your program. My question for you is more about where are you operating? What kind of classrooms? How do you find your classrooms? In what countries are you currently focused in?
So we're currently in 4 countries, the UK, the US, Botswana, and India. And to be honest, that's very much through our own networks. And we're very, very open to expanding to any country, any classroom that's interested. And again, we haven't so much picked where we are as more, this is very much our first year that we launched this year and are expanding for next year. So it was more the classrooms and schools that came to us.
Wonderful. So if we have any participants of this webinar who are interested in collaborating with you, how would they make that happen?
I was just about to put our website in the chat because someone asked for it, but I'll also put my email as well. That would be brilliant.
Perfect. It does look like also there is one question I see in the chat box for you, Keya. Does the curriculum state that climate change is human caused? And if so, how does that affect acceptance at the local school level?
Yes, it absolutely does. And I think that is one thing that is really missing in a lot of science curriculum and environmental curriculum, to be honest, is that it is human caused. But I think what we try to do is balance, yes, it's human caused, but also there's a lot of human actions that can combat it. And so I think emphasizing both sides is important. And that's what we mean about the positive and empowering approach is, yes, we talk about the causes, but we also talk about everyday solutions that everyone can take.
Wonderful. Bruce, I believe we are at the point now to open the floor for general Q&A if anyone has any questions.
Do you see any questions in the chat? I don't see any offhand.
I also do not see any in the chat. If people also would want to raise their hands to ask questions, that's also a feature that we have enabled. So there are any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we can hear it from you directly. I will ask one for Dr. Ehrhart. What you said about, I think you saw everyone in the squares nodding their heads when you were talking about taxing rich white men. Are there examples, or are there any countries who are doing, not necessarily taxing rich white men, but who have made policy and legislation changes where it very much so is a taxation of lifestyle? Are there any real life examples of these kind of decisions that have been made?
It's a good question. I think that there's been some.
Oops, he muted
Oops.
himself.
Yep, you went on. Sorry.
Sorry, there was a piece of dust and I was getting the dust away, and of course that muted myself. What I was saying was that unfortunately there are not that many examples. I don't have an authoritative list or anything. I think that there's been some progress in Sweden, for example, on carbon taxing. I refer to it as greenhouse gas taxing because I think it's so important to not just think that CO2 is the problem, but also methane and nitrous oxide and all the other different greenhouse gases. So I think that unfortunately, sometimes when carbon taxing or greenhouse gas taxing has been implemented, it has been done in pretty clunky ways. For one thing, I mean, what comes to mind is the Gilets Jaunes movement in France. What this was the French government decided to put a gasoline tax on gasoline, and so they didn't really think about the fact that for wealthy people, gas goes up a few cents, like big deal, but for a lot of middle class people and working class people, that is a big deal. And so and the way that the tax was structured, the revenues were not being we're not going back to the people who were being affected. Now you might say, well, why should they go back to the people? Well, that's because otherwise people don't like those policies, right? And so the Gilets Jaunes movement was that all these drivers took to the streets and protested and said like we're getting the short end of the deal here, and they were right. Of course, the intent of the policy was to drive down emissions, but they really blew it in terms of the way they designed things because it was impacting lower and middle income folks more. So so that's one thing, as I was mentioning about the way that the taxation could work is really to make sure that either income taxes or other ways of reducing burdens on lower and middle income folks, because basically if people, after a policy is implemented, if those people feel like they're in a worse position than they used to be, that they're going to turn against it. It's very simple. So I think we got to be smart about things. Make sure that that the taxation burden hits those who can afford it the most, wealthy individuals and big corporations and things, so that those folks would not be getting the dividend, right? Like their corporate taxes or the taxes on the wealthy would not be going down, or at least not going down as much as taxes on regular working people. So so I think I hope across the political spectrum there's kind of probably more support for that than a lot of other ideas. Like as long as it's really packaged well and the legislation is written well, and I think there's some hope for that. So I guess, yeah, it's sort of maybe even the way that it's described too, that's, I think, like the sort of the marketing of changes in policy. If it's described as a tax rather than a dividend, then it might not work. So you think about kind of getting people on board through describing like, how is this going to help your life? Are you going to have more money in your pocket to spend? And then also, if you use some of those revenues maybe to help out a public transit system, or to maybe establish more electric charging stations for electric cars or things like that, so people can still get around easier, rather than harder as a result of that policy.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
I have a question. I think probably for Keya, that the countries that you're already doing your curriculum in, like two of them are the biggest causers of climate change, and the other two are the victims. How do you address that in your curriculum? Is that something that is important? Because I think it is.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and honestly something that we considered when looking at our target markets. And actually we decided to start with the US and the UK, one, because that's where we were based, but two, exactly as you said, sort of in terms of big causers. And there is a argument to be made that actually the people who do need to learn about this the most are the ones who are causing the most issues. And actually, to be honest, the schools that reached out to us in India and Botswana were completely, they reached out to us as opposed to us, targeting them. And yes, actually not in the younger grades, like say, I think the 3 to 7 year olds, we don't touch on it as much. We focus more on their local environment. But then with the older age groups, 8 to 11, we do get into sort of global issues and what that looks like in the world. And even because we do sort of virtual pen pal programs and things with schools amid other countries. So right now we're doing one between our schools in the UK and schools in India. So it's really interesting as well for students to see and learn about the different issues and what's going on. So absolutely, we do address it in sort of the older age groups, but not in the youngest ones.
I'll ask a question as well to Keya. We're getting some very kind of weird feedback here in the United States to education on LGBT issues and also on racism. There are states that are basically passing laws not allowing that kind of education. Have you encountered any resistance to education on climate change? I mean, official resistance, governmental resistance.
Excellent question. Yeah. Yes. So what I would say is that so far, the schools, governments, local councils, school districts we have engaged in are extremely self-selecting. I will say that in our first year, where they are sort of, if you will, the low-hanging fruit in terms of they already believe in this and they believe it's an important issue. So what we've decided to do in our first year is focus on helping those who already believe in it and want to implement it, but don't have the resources. And then in our next year, actually, we're going to tackle sort of changing those mindsets. So I would say as of now, no, but again, that's because we've been very selective in the schools that have come to us in this first year, but that is absolutely something that we are going to face in our second year and are working on a strategy for right now, because it is very, very prevalent in certain geographical areas.
Hello. I also have a question regarding EarthWarriors. So I was looking through your website a bit, and I see that you partner with UNESCO and National Geographic, which are both extremely helpful with providing information. And I was wondering, like, what type of partnership do you have with them, and are the children able to work with them at all, or is there any like interaction or just more information about that partnership?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the UNESCO, the partnership we have is that we have been recognized as one of their Green Citizens initiatives. So I believe it's linked in my website. And if it's not, please tell me because I will fix that. But they essentially pick 100 innovations each year that they think are scalable, reputable, and helping the health of the planet. So that was that. And then second, for National Geographic, it was a really interesting partnership because they and we identified in animated videos that exist to explain this topic to really young kids, because a lot of the animated videos you see out there are either very scientific and pitched at sort of an older age group, or just not at all appropriate for the sort of youngest age group. So we've actually developed with them a video to explain climate change to 3 to 7 year olds. And it is coming out in the next month. We're very excited, both on our website and their website. So please do look out for that. But yeah, the partnerships we made are very, very specific around specific things that we feel are sort of a gap in the market for this young age group that we are trying to provide for teachers. So that video will be freely available. And another thing we've done as well with the Stanford School of Earth is to create a set of global climate change learning standards for 3 to 7 year olds, because again, a lot of that exists out there, including, you know, the next generation science standards in the US. The New Jersey has actually put climate change standards in their state standards, and also the Leeds University in the UK has done climate change standards, but they're all sort of age 5 or age 7 and above. So we're trying to fill that gap in the 3 to 7 year olds age group.
Do we have any more questions?
If we don't, Amanda, maybe you can take us out. I think we have a final statement.
Yes, I'm going to pass it to Hallie, actually.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, it's my turn today. I'm just going to say thank you so much to our speakers who've taken time out of their day to be part of this event. And all three of you have provided so much information and added so much context to what we already know. We've recorded this, and we will send a recording to everyone who has been part of it, so you can so you'll see this later. But I also wanted to let you know that we have another webinar tomorrow. Sadly, it's at 8 o'clock in the morning, so hopefully you're all early risers. But it's another CSW event, and it's talking about LGBTQ people in the workforce. And we have 3 speakers, one who's going to be talking about India and the third gender community in India, Pakistan, and that part of the world. Another who's talking about people from Turkey. And the third speaker is going to be talking from the US angle. So I think it's also going to be very interesting and very important, just along with the whole thing that we've been talking about today. And I think someone's going to be putting that link in the chat so that you can see that if you need to. But just thank you so much. It's been really great. It's been very, very interesting and informative.
Thank you very much to the organizers.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you all.
And they were so good. We'll be coming back to you, I'm sure, for further presentations.
We have you now, Dr. Rock.